It's a great pleasure for me to be invited to come along and talk to you today. And as the theme is fairness between the generations, the NAPF has had the brilliant idea of actually having some representatives of different generations to join us. And I'm delighted that we've got two different groups, shall we say delicately, slightly older people on one side and representatives of the younger generation on the other. And in a moment, I'm going to try to lead off a discussion, which I hope will not end up as fisticuffs or rowing, but we will just get an exchange as to find out what is the reality of the different opportunities facing different generations. But let me just set the scene by saying how great it is to be here. Joanne tells me that I happen to be wearing the new colours of the new brand identity for what I still think of as the NAPF, but as after today we're not allowed to call it that anymore. So it's great to be here to talk to you as experts on pensions. I am here partly because I wrote a book about the subject. No point being subtle about these things. I've learned you have to hold the book up for longer than feels natural just to get the message across. In fact, I was even told that William Hague may have given it a plug yesterday. But my book, The Pinch, though I say it myself, out of all the sort of books written about British society since the war, looking at all the obvious differences and gaps and inequalities, gaps by social class, gaps by gender, I think it was the first book to look at Britain from the prism of different generations, and whether different generations were having different opportunities in life. And just to define my terms, my definition of the baby boomers as people born between 1945 and 1965, which neatly covers and includes within it the 2 years when we had more than 1 million babies born in Britain in 1947 and in 1964. Some people point out that was after 2 very cold winters, which may have had something to do with it. But throughout that entire 20-year period, we never had fewer than 800,000 babies born in Britain every year. And then after the mid-60s, there was a rapid decline in the number of babies born. It varied a bit, but it's only recently, only literally in the last year or two, that we've once again had more than 800,000 babies born. So that cohort in that 20 years is a big cohort, and generations after have been smaller cohorts. And the conventional view amongst demographers was that by and large, it was a better deal if you were born in a small cohort than a big cohort. Small cohorts, and you kind of traveled through life business class, not economy class. There was a less competitive labour market. You had fewer people jostling for jobs or houses. So the assumption, most eloquently put forward by one of the great demographers of the 20th century, Richard Easterlin, was that better to be born in a small cohort. But the evidence that I assembled in my book, and there's a lot more evidence come on since now that there's, partly as a result of the book, there's much more analysis of Britain by different age cohorts. The evidence I developed in my book suggests, if anything, the opposite, and that you get a better deal in life if you are born in a big cohort than in a small cohort. And you could speculate about that, but there are several ways you could explain it. One way you can explain it is in terms of market power. That those big cohorts are big groups of consumers. It's why the Rolling Stones are still on tour. There are lots of consumers around for whom the Rolling Stones in their youth were a crucial experience. So being a big consumer segment increases your market power. And then you could also argue that in a modern democracy, with all the instruments of the welfare state available, having a big block of voting power enables you to vote for policies that serve the interests of your age group. So you can see why it might have turned out the way it did. I think the most powerful evidence about what is happening for large cohorts as against small cohorts, and particularly for the baby boomers, concerns their 2 main forms of assets that people build up during their working lives. the house and the pension. And for both of those assets, and again, I have some preliminary figures in the book, but it's got much more sophisticated, the evidence since. For both of those assets, we can see a very similar story. When, after the baby boomers were born and with a surge in the population, we had a housing boom. We were building through the 50s and 60s 300,000 homes a year. And that's why, one of the many reasons why, as those baby boomers emerged and got into work and looked to buy a place of their own, there were lots of houses around that they could afford to buy. Since then, the planning rules have got more restricted, and for lots of other reasons as well, it's become much harder to build a house in Britain than it was 25 or 50 years ago. In fact, one of the experiences that led me to write the book was absolutely when I was a member of Parliament, going to meetings of local residents associations full of absolutely decent people. They weren't bad people. They were socially engaged. They were active. They were almost all aged over 50. They almost all had a home of their own. And one of their main objectives of the resident association was to stop any more housing being built, because they were beyond their house, it was green fields, or they didn't want any more housing. And as I tried to work out ways of persuading them that we needed to have more houses built, I would say, well, don't you want your son or daughter or your grandchildren perhaps to have the same kind of opportunity to have a house as you did? But it's clear that house building is now at half the level that it used to be. Despite the best efforts of successive governments, I think recently it's become more and more significant on the policy agenda. And if we want to explain high house prices, although there is lots of intricate financial issues as well, the fundamental fact is if you are not building enough houses relative to the demand, then the price is going to go up, and that is fundamentally what's happening. And then you look at pensions, and I actually think there's quite a strong analogy, because I suspect people born in that baby boomer cohort, by and large, entered jobs where there was some kind of company pension. And over the decades, and this is something I observed when I was the member of the Shadow Cabinet responsible for pensions, but it goes back before that. You could argue that the crucial moment was the Maxwell scandal in the early 90s. What happened was that having joined company pension schemes, we all wanted to see more and more regulation to make that pension promise ever more secure, ever more copper-bottomed. And what had begun really as almost a with profits policy, with quite a lot of flexibility for the employer about the exact terms on which retirees, pensioners would get their pension, successive governments legislated to turn that into an absolute untouchable property right for an index-linked, price-protected pension with a requirement to hold a large amount of assets to back it up. And for those of us who are in those type of schemes, it's been absolutely fantastic. They've ended up with a far more rigorous level of protection than was ever envisaged when we first joined them. But there's one problem. Once you have that kind of amount of regulation and protection around a pension, the employers decided they were never going to make that mistake again, and have moved away from providing those type of pensions for future generations. And there are, of course, other forms of pension provision, and I salute the initiative of auto-enrollment. But again, you can see protecting our pensions at the expense of future generations having a similar pension. And then, as the final twist, and this is something that we're doing work on at the Resolution Foundation, the think tank which I now chair, as the final twist, where even after the pension scheme may have closed, be it to certainly closed to new members and quite possibly changing its terms now for existing members as well. If that pension has got a deficit, and as you know, many of them do, the current workforce have to work and generate revenues to plug the pension deficit. So young employees are joining companies where part of their purpose of the wealth they create is to plug pension deficits in schemes to which they themselves which they themselves are not members of and have no prospect of joining. And this is something we've been studying at the Resolution Foundation, because our focus is on living standards and pay. And one of the fascinating questions is why pay is lagging behind GDP per head. And one of the reasons is, one of the reasons why this is happening is that total compensation to labour, to workers in different forms, is now rising more than take-home pay, because those pension contributions into the pension scheme count as part of returns to labour in the national statistics, so they show as compensation to workers, but they're not received in the pay packets of workers. So there's a wedge opening up between the pay that you receive and the total labour cost as an employer sees it, and part of that wedge is the pension contribution, the money that's going in contributions into pension schemes of which younger employees may not even be members. So I think we have a similar issue in pensions as we do on housing. Now, just finally, before we turn to our two representative groups, let me make one other point, which is sometimes my book and these arguments have been presented as kind of examples of me promoting intergenerational conflict. And I don't, I mean, you will reach your own views. I hope that's not what I'm trying to do. I actually think paradoxically, the quality of the personal relations between the generations, if anything, is getting better. I think that families are much more, probably family life has rather less generational conflict of the sort that I remember from my youth. In fact, there's a paradox here, which is that as our society is changing, families are also changing. In families, as families get smaller, you have more and more kind of bamboo-style, tall, thin families. We're much more likely to have surviving parents, grandparents, kids, than brothers, sisters, cousins. Our family relationships are more intergenerational than they were in the days where people died younger and you had larger families, when your family relationships were much more likely to be with members of your own age. So the family has become a more significant, tall, thin, intergenerational unit, whilst across society as a whole, we tend to work with people of our own age, we tend to socialise with people of our own age. As the new media enable us to have more narrow-casted experiences, we can watch the TV programmes or the shows or access the social media, by and large, of people of our own age. So we're living in an age-segregated society, but in age-connected families, tall, thin families in a broad age-segregated society. So that means that our main form of intergenerational exchange is often within the family. I don't believe there is a desire by one group of one age to explicitly do down another generation, but I don't think people realise what they were doing. I think that's why I could sometimes see how you could win an argument for more housing if you put it in terms of we need this for the younger generation. I don't think when people voted for those improvements in the regulation of pensions, they were deliberately doing it to deprive the younger generation of the opportunity of ever having a defined benefit pension scheme, but that was a consequence, an unexpected, unanticipated consequence. So I don't think there is actual conflict. In fact, I think the more that we bring this issue out, then I hope we might find there's a bit more willingness to see the give and take and the contact between the generations that we need. Well, that's the backdrop. Let's now turn to these two representative groups. And whenever I'm talking about age issues, I always have to begin, it's like a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, by declaring my age. And I'm going to ask our guests to declare their age. I was born in 1956. I was born in the middle of the baby boom, in the kind of shallow U part of the boom between the two peaks. And you will hear that our older group are not all exactly baby boomers, but I'm going to ask I'm going to start with our four representatives of older generations to begin by giving their age in as broad an approximation as they feel comfortable with, and And answering the question, do you think, when you compare your prospects and the prospects of the younger generation, do you think that the older generation is having a better deal than the younger generation? Let's start here.
So born in 1970, so I'm 45.
And what's your view about sort of fairness between the generations? Because you're just a post-boomer, so you weren't actually in the big generation that I was describing, but how, in terms of pensions, housing, I don't know if you've got kids, do you think that, or looking at kids of your friends, do you think they've got different kind of prospects than you have?
I don't think it's an ageist thing, I think it's a generational thing. So I've got two children, one's 17 and one's 19, and just started university like a group across the stage there. So I suppose it's about thinking about myself, but also about their prospects when they get older.
And how do you think their prospects are compared with your prospects?
I think they've got more opportunities than perhaps I did in terms of globalization now. So I think if they want to go and do things, not necessarily in this country, that they've got huge opportunities. But then that, I suppose, links in with, would they want to buy a house and have a mortgage because they might not live in this country?
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting thing, globalization, because it cuts both ways. It's true that, look, I can still remember the excitement of first, with an enormous fuss in the family, as we all saved up, flying to France for a holiday when I was about 13 or 14, I think the first time I'd gone abroad. Nowadays, it's completely different. On the other hand, the globalization has also meant that the younger generation are competing with workers in China and Brazil and India, and one of the many factors holding down wages compared with the kind of starter wages we had when we entered the jobs market is the level of competition. In our day, the world market that we were aware of was Europe and the US, basically. It's been transformed. Now, what about you, sir?
I'm Gordon, and I was born in 1955, so I'm classed as one of the baby boomers. I'm 60-year-old last June. So, I mean, my thoughts are, I don't feel like we had a magnificent, easy time through my life. It was as tough as it is now. When I started off, I found it very difficult, to get into work at the time. I went to university, came out of university, and then I got a part-time job and I stayed with that company. I don't see it as being more difficult now. It's about what your aspirations are, I think, in life. I remember the most toughest times for me was when I was in my 30s. And at the time, I had a house, I had a mortgage, I had 2 young children, a third on the way. My wife was working part-time, I was full-time. And like a lot of people, I had debt. So I had a loan, I had 2 loans, a credit card, maxed out. And I was trying to balance that debt with trying to get on in life and trying to get myself straight. And the biggest thing for me is you've got to break out of that debt cycle. And I agree with what's happening with the government. We have to get out the debt. Because if we don't get out the debt, we're wasting all the billions of money on paying interest on debt. And once we get out of that, we can invest that in what we want to invest in. Pensions, housing, schools, whatever.
Right. Yep. And you, sir?
Okay, I'm 38, so I'm a bit outside of the baby boom. And do I think that the younger generation have more prospects? Yeah, they have more opportunity to gain more prospects because they've got a longer lifespan to do that in, as we've spent half of our life, really. But we've all got opportunities and prospects ahead, haven't we?
Right. And you?
Yes, I'm 51. I was born in 64, so part of the baby boom. Prospects, I think it's quite equal. I wanted different things when I was my daughter's age. I wanted a house. The last thing on my daughter's mind is a house. She likes earning money and living with mum. So she doesn't want right. to buy a house. The big wide world there, she wants to go travelling, she wants to go abroad.
And how many of you own your own home?
Yes.
How many? You own your house?
Yep.
I do, yes.
You own your house, and
So I owned an apartment in Manchester city centre and sold it 2 years ago, and invested the profit I made from that and currently rent now.
Right.
And I'm still renting, yeah.
Right. So we've got. And how many of you were in? I think you were all in a company pension scheme.
Yes.
So we've got sort of 2.5 property owners. There has been a property owner and took a decision on a different form of asset, and all 4 of you are in a company pension scheme, though we know that those are changing. But you, and this is the kind of conversation I often have with all you don't think you've had any particular advantage, and it was tough, I realise that, but you have ended up with 3 of you having had the opportunity of owning a house, and all of you having been in a company pension scheme. So let's now hear from the younger generation, 4 young students, and I'm going to ask you the same kind of question. I think you're a slightly narrower age range. I think we can take it, the answer is born between 1995 and 1996. So we've got students currently at Manchester University, and it's fantastic that they've come along to join us. But do you want to just give your names and say how you see your prospects, particularly on those 2 things of a house, and maybe you don't want to own a house, or a pension, and maybe not interested in a pension, but do you want to start?
I'm Grace, I'm 19. I think we probably have got it a bit harder, if I'm honest, because the youth unemployment is so high these days. Like, we've chosen to go to university, but if we hadn't done that, I think we'd have had very few chances of getting a job out there. So I think that's probably quite a lot harder for us, which obviously means owning a house one day is probably going to be hard as well. Like, I'm not expecting that, whereas I think it probably used to be an expected thing that you would probably own a house, whereas I'm not sure we're that confident on that anymore.
Right, and you?
I'm Charlotte and I'm 19 as well. I think it's really hard for us to tell what our prospects are. I mean, we're still at university, we have no idea, but we are always told that we probably will never own a house and that we probably don't have like that many opportunities like after university. We're told that all the time. And we also do have that additional debt like weighted over us. But we are also quite a bad representation because we're all at university. So like we might think that we actually do have quite good prospects and we maybe not be that worried. But yeah, people that obviously didn't go to university, like they might have much worse off because it's more of a requirement now because more of us go to university.
Yeah, yeah. And you?
I'm Amy and I'm 19, and I get the thing that's saying about that we've got better opportunities in the terms that like we can travel more. I think we've got like, in terms of education, it is more now a given that you can go to university because you don't have to pay. You've got like obviously the student loans, you don't have to pay up front and everything like that. I think it's quite nice that we have that chance, but then I think it's going to be a lot harder afterwards because we'll have this debt before we can even think about owning a house. So whereas I think for the older generation, it was easier to get their kind of foot in the door with housing because it'd be a job straight away and then they could just work towards a house. With us, we'll have that debt that we need to consider paying off first.
Yep.
Hi, I'm Owen, I'm 19. I think whilst a lot of people go to university, it's something like 50% or something, that's a really good thing, but it's after university. I'm not quite sure our prospects are looking good after that. I think, especially since the financial crash, if you don't get a job in the area you've studied and the area you want to go into, if you don't get that within a few years, it'll be very hard to get back on track for that. And I think, getting housing is quite hard, yeah.
And of course, I mean, and this is another issue we're going to touch on, the fees and loan system, well, that began under the previous government, is something I massively increased the fees and the loans. And I would argue that on that, it was hard, given the pressures on public spending, it was hard to see how we could afford to continue expanding places at university unless we expected graduates to pay back. But I do realise it means that you've got another obligation. It's kind of like a higher rate of income debt. It's not like a credit card debt or a mortgage, but it does mean that on basic rate tax, when we have brought the basic rate down to 20% for many of the people in this hall, you will be on essentially 29%, but above a high threshold. So as you're likely to be in better paid jobs than non-graduates. I think it's fair to ask you to pay back, but it is indeed, I fully accept, another cost that you face as graduates. Which of you think, I mean, and you may want to ask me more about that, or do any of you think you will end up as homeowners? How many of you are hoping and expecting to own a home?
I'm not expecting to.
Right.
Hoping to.
Right. Hoping to and expecting to, or?
I don't know.
And what about pensions? And most people 19 or 20 are not thinking about pensions, but have you any idea about how you would start saving, or what decisions you'd need to take to start saving?
Yeah, I think I think we have a lot more worry in our life, because we need to think, now that we know that pensions are decreasing, that it's going to be harder to get a house, we do have to think ahead. So I think that even now, I'll be getting my student loan, but I've started saving already, like just for, I don't know what it'll be for after university. And I know that obviously a lot of people will just spend it and they'll go into their overdraft. But I think we do have to think ahead a lot more than older generations did have to.
I know people that already pay into pension funds now.
Hmm?
I know people that already pay into pension
our
funds
age.
now.
Wow.
And don't you think that's like
That deserves a round of applause, doesn't it? I mean, this is a pension convention.
That's like, I don't know, as a student, I find that quite scary that like people are already thinking about that. Don't even have like their career path yet.
Isn't this, so turning back to this group, isn't this revealing quite an important difference? That we didn't have to think that much about either a house or a pension. They just seemed natural kind of things that you did. You started work and you as we know from the statistics, most people were first-time buyers in their 20s. The company provided a pension scheme which you weren't that interested in, but it just kind of happened. And isn't the difference that some of the things that for us just happened now are much more of a challenge that people work towards and are not sure they're going to achieve it? In some ways, the younger generation are more serious-minded than we were, but more serious-minded because some of the things that happened automatically for us don't look so straightforward for them. Do you recognise that?
Mm-hmm. I think we're lucky in the north of England that housing is cheaper than the south, obviously. So you can get into housing. My 3 children are all in small private houses, which each cost around £100,000 each. So they could get in with a £5,000 deposit, which this day and age you can save towards that,
Yep.
which is what we had to do. Luckily, I got a 100% mortgage when I was 28, when I first bought in. So I wasn't very young in my early 20s, but I was 28. I rented till that point and saved up, but I got a 100% mortgage, whereas you can't really get a 100% mortgage nowadays. But you can get a 95% mortgage, and housing in the north is quite economical still compared to the national average.
Any other points on that?
I think it's quite peculiar about this country. We're so obsessed with home ownership. If you look at a lot of countries in Europe, home ownership is significantly less. But that would obviously mean that government policy, for example, would have to change to help people who didn't own their own home to, have somewhere else to live. But I think the two have got to go hand in hand.
Do you think, as it is more likely you're going to be renting, either for longer, or what about the kind of relationship, the kind of experience of renting? I mean, there is some evidence that people who rent, sometimes they're not always in kind of living conditions one would hope. On the other hand, if you're mobile and moving around and trying to travel abroad and all those kind of things we've been hearing about, clearly renting makes perfect sense. By and large, people who rent, they're rather less rooted in their local communities. But again, that's just the other side of the same phenomenon. If you want to be mobile and travelling, you're also less likely to be rooted and fixed. So does the fact that you're likely to be renting for a long time, does that worry you, or you're fine with it?
Well, it seems like it's a lifestyle choice to a large extent in a lot of ways. Like, as you say, like travelling a lot, you want to rent because you don't want to be fixed. But like if you've got a job that requires you to stay in one place or a family that's built up in one place, and I think like ideally you'd like to not be paying rent there, you'd like to own your own home there if you plan on having a base. I think it's quite...
I know personally, like I've been told by my family in Norway never to rent. Like it just seems, and like just logically it seems like such a waste of money just if you're planning on staying somewhere for a reasonably long time, if you've got a job that you're not planning, like if you're not properly traveling around the world or just generally, then I think it's just the fact that we have to rent is going to be so hard on us, because you could say rent a house for 5 years but you've got nothing from that, whereas I think it was a lot easier back then to kind of get into a mortgage, and then at least you've got something to show for it after the 5 years.
Because in a way, what you did is an interesting example. You were an owner-occupier, but the very fact of being an owner-occupier, presumably we're obviously not expecting any detail about this, but actually it meant that you ended up with an asset that you could do something else with if you didn't want to be an owner-occupier. So that it was a route to something else as well. It was a route to a personal nest egg.
Yeah, I mean, the property we bought in the city centre was as an investment, and it was too good an opportunity not to sell that investment at one stage. I'm not saying I would never own a home again, but the minute the flexibility is good.
Mm-hmm. Now, what about another form of wealth that people have, the other big form, they have the pension? And you mentioned, I think one of you mentioned that you know somebody was already saving. Have you come across, and I mean you're very young and it's not, we quite understand that it's not come across your radar yet, but are you aware of things like auto-enrolment in pensions? Are you expecting to have a personal pension? How much do you think that might, when have you started thinking, or has anybody approached you about pension issues at any point?
No.
I haven't been approached hear much about it, to be honest.
Absolutely no idea.
Yeah. It'd be nice to know more. I feel like we need to start thinking of our futures a lot more than we are currently.
Well, you've come to the right place, actually. Free advice about pensions, this is the place to come. They're all regulated, don't worry, they're all okay. If you were saving, if you were aiming to start saving, one or two of you mentioned people starting to save, where would you save? Are you aware of any kind of forms of saving that you might take on?
Bank accounts.
I've got a few. Like I've got money in premium bonds as well. I know people say it's a really stupid decision, but it's just, I think I've got it in a few different places, just I don't know.
Right, right. And if we could do anything that would help you get started in the kind of ways you want, what would you, and when you talk to your parents or perhaps even your grandparents about it, what kind of things do you ask for? What would you think, where would you like more help?
Well, I know my mum's thinking of retiring soon, and she's upset because she's got to work for another 2 years before she can, because obviously it's just getting older and older. So that's a concern for us. Like, we don't want to be working till we're 80. We want to be able to retire at like a fair age.
So you're worried that these increasing the pension age will carry on?
Yeah.
And that you'll be working for a long time?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think there'll be a state pension for you when you do eventually retire?
Like to hope so.
Yeah.
Fingers crossed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what about some of these special arrangements that older people get, like, and again, we haven't really got any examples on the other side, but free travel, free bus passes, things like that. Presumably some of you have parents or grandparents who are benefiting from those. Yeah. Whereas I think some of the free travel schemes for younger people, funding them getting to college or funding travel costs to employment, even though I think those are by and large gone. Do you compare travel costs across the generations?
Yeah, well, we get some subsidising for our Manchester bus pass, but it's not free, and whereas obviously it's a lot more expensive for us.
£225 for the year.
So it's
I know in Birmingham anyway, from the age of 16 you're considered an adult, and then it's £2.20 for a single bus ticket, which is a lot of money when you're that age, because obviously we're still in school, so we didn't have jobs. And if we wanted to go anywhere, £4.20 return was just it's a bit steep, really.
Expensive.
And I think I think it's fair to say both us and the older generations can be considered dependents. I mean, we're still dependent on the working age people. I wouldn't say that we're any less entitled to be dependent. I mean, we're definitely all working towards a degree. We're working towards, in like a growing population, we need new scientific methods to take on all this stuff. And so we definitely see our dependency on the working generations for now as legitimate as the old people's. As older generations. And it definitely doesn't quite seem fair that, free travel happens for them when, a lot of us are still working, so we can contribute to society when we can.
Right. Now, do we have any comments on this from the middle-aged, not elderly, but middle-aged cohort?
Yeah.
I think it's fascinating that they're really interested in pensions at this age, because 2 of my children are under 30. I'm having to sit down and talk to them because they're not particularly interested. Because with the new work-based pensions, they're going to have to be paying like £70 a month out of their monthly pay, and they're not looking forward to that prospect at all. And they see it like 30, 40 years ahead. But, having spoke to them, it is one of the best savings things, I believe, that you'll ever put into, because, you get it tax-free and then you get 100% put in from your employee. Where are you going to get that sort of return from anywhere else?
Yeah. But you've been in a company pension for...
I'm lucky, I've been in a final salary, so I've benefited enormously.
And do you think that your kids, even when they get saving through that kind of auto-enrollment system, if they build up a pot, do you think it's going to pay them a pension on the same kind of scale as the pension you're getting or will get?
Well, it's related to what your annual earnings are, isn't it? So it's respective to that. But I sat down with one of my sons 2 days ago and worked out, he pulled his 3 pensions out from the 3 different companies he's worked for and the one he's got now, and we worked out what he'd have when he retired. And, it was a reasonable amount to live on if you get the state benefit pension as well. So he was quite pleased with that. So if you put into the pension at an early age, even the current pensions, you will get a realistic amount. If you want more than that, obviously you've either got to invest or go into property or do something else, haven't you, as well?
Mm-hmm. Any other views on this?
I think you worry. I've got 2 girls, and I do worry, because I can see, even at 51, I think, will I get a state pension? Because it's increasing the retirement age. So I do worry, and I do have conversations with them, and we are looking into that now for them, because we were lucky. We were automatically enrolled into the pension scheme in our company. So, but they haven't got that luxury. So I do think that they need to, at 20 and 21, they need to be looking now.
So I think there's a real theme emerging here that people kind of, in a way, we're expecting more forward thinking and more careful decision taking from the younger generation than perhaps we had to do ourselves, things that happened much more automatically for us. And so that involves planning, but it sounds like you, as students at Manchester University, you're beginning to think about that. What about conversations with your parents? Do you ever, I don't know if your parents are owner-occupiers, are any of you talking to them about how you wouldn't mind their help getting started on the housing ladder and things like that?
Well, I'm currently being funded through university. Like, I don't think I can ask for much more money than I already have.
So you're not in the fees and loan system, you've asked them. When you say you're being funded through university, in what way?
Well, I've got the fees and loans, but it's not enough to live off. Like,
right.
you have to have support from my parents as well, and because I've got quite a full-on course, I don't have time for a part-time job. So I get so much money off my parents. Like,
right.
I can't ask for more.
Right. So they're paying you an allowance.
Yeah.
Right. While you're at university. What about you guys?
I don't get any money from my mom, but that's because my loan covers it enough. But I don't think I ever would ask, even for a house. I don't know, the view that I've got is as long as I've got enough to live on comfortably, then I just do it myself. That's my personal view.
Yeah, I haven't spoken to my parents about it, so
No, I've not discussed it.
it's apathy that I'm not.
Fascinating. So this is not something that you would, well, clearly you haven't. And are your parents owner-occupiers?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what do you think they're going to do with the value of their house? Have they got any?
Not on the vast.
So we've got here, this is fantastic. So you are independent, you're thinking about what you want to do for your financial plans. You're getting some support from your parents, but you're not expecting any more than that. Now, what about other issues? What about the question of the kind of welfare state, the kind of public services that you might get? Do you think the kind of public services that we have enjoyed through our lives, and there's the state pension, but there's other things as well, do you think they're going to be around for the younger generation as well?
I think that all public services are getting cut back and are under threat. I mean, just look at care. You know, there's no way now that you can get looked after in social care without paying for it yourself. So the houses that my parents would have bought would have had to have been sold to pay for that. So there is nothing left to pass down the generations. But that is unfortunately the way that we live. That's what the system that we're involved in. Whether that's right or wrong is a different matter. But I don't think there is that money being passed down anymore.
Do you think it's reasonable to expect, if someone owns their home and it's got some value, do you think it's reasonable to expect that should be used up as an asset to pay for their care if they're very old and frail?
Yeah, I really do. It is money that person owns in an asset, and there is no God-given right for that money to be kept within that family. Someone has to pay for it, and it's just a matter of who.
I slightly disagree. I slightly disagree because I think, we've paid taxes all our life. Even when we take a pension, and when I retire shortly, I'll still be paying tax on my pension because it'll be over the threshold of 10,600. So I'll be continually putting money into the economy and into the tax system throughout my pensionable age. And then for someone to say, well, we've got to take the house off you. I've had that humorous conversation with my 3 children. I said, the only thing you'll be getting passed down from me is my house. You'll get a third each, and if one of you doesn't put me in your house if I go ill, then it will get devoured. So they're busy working out who's going to put me up.
And what's their reaction to that?
They're thinking about it, yes.
You've got a view on this?
I just find it quite, I don't know, I just think it's a little bit unfair. I've recently lost my mother and my mother-in-law, and my mother had nothing and my mother-in-law had a house, property, money. But we used all that, there's nothing left when she passed away, because we used all that to pay for her care. But my mum, in my opinion, got better care off the state.
Interesting. Interesting.
First of all, I'd like to swap 2 of these over here for 2 of my children because my son started university 2 weeks ago and is draining my bank balance already. I think there were other, we were talking earlier on around things like bus passes and TV licenses and winter fuel payments. There are things like that some of us are in a fortunate position not to need support with. So I do think from a government point of view we should be looking at means testing some of those, and some of us, as I say, fortunately don't need that and allow that pot of money to be used for other people.
That's a very fair point, and there are certainly some of these programs, if you get, regardless of your personal circumstances, but just because of your age, are going to help older people who are themselves pretty affluent. What about inheritance? How important do you think inheritance is for the younger generation? We're talking about the value of the house, and you've got kind of 2.5 property owners here. Is that going to be something that you're imagining that you want to distribute it to your kids unless you need it for your nursing home costs? How long? Have any of you got any plan? Or what about the idea that, for example, if your parents, when sadly they pass away, that's an asset you can skip a generation and help your kids get started on the housing ladder?
Yeah, so my idea of selling my property and using that money to invest is so that I can release some of that money earlier for my kids rather than having to wait until I die before they get it.
Mm-hmm. That's something, yeah?
Yeah, I obviously want to support and help my children. I got no inheritance. Both my parents have died and I received no inheritance from them. And I just want to leave something that I've worked hard for 42 years to give them an extra start and lift in the middle years of their life.
Right. Well, we're getting towards the end of the session. Let's hear some final comments from both groups. Is there anything that you are... I mean, we've got a clear... I think it's a fair summary that, first of all, there is not a direct conflict here. But some of the things that perhaps, as we went through our lives, have kind of fallen into our laps, that happened a bit more automatically for us. You're having to think more carefully about how you get them, and you're not totally sure you are going to get a house or a pension. But you are getting some of you are getting some support from your parents already. Anything else that you feel about this? Do you think it is ultimately fair the way things are playing out, or do you think there are things that need to happen to make it more fair?
I generally think there's not really fairness about it, it's just the way that things have played out. But there's a general consensus among the young that we can't really rely upon the state or really upon anyone to get a pension, to get a house, and that's why we have to get a good degree, and we have to work hard, and we have to start saving now while we've got the opportunities and the money. And basically we're a bit in despair.
Anything else that you guys want to say?
Yeah, I mean, I slightly disagree with that. I personally do think it is a little unfair. I think a lot of, and I mean, it's the way it is in the fact that, young people are a smaller demographic who also don't vote as much, so we do have some of the blame to have for that. But a lot of policy is targeted towards older generations, especially on things that are like just handouts and giveaways. I mean, so like for example, the free BBC license, for example, I mean, is a little bit of a joke. Especially, just little things like that. We just don't get the receiving end of that, mainly because we're not a particularly big voting group, and so I think we definitely have it worse off for that. Just that we're not targeted. When how can we make our lives a little easier? It's the older generations who get that.
Right, and do you have a...
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't think, obviously we generally, going to university and stuff, we have a bit better prospects in general, and we're not a good representation because only 50%, I think, is around that, go to university. But I think there should be more available to us, even though we are taking a lot of it on ourselves, saying we should save and we need to think about pensions. I still think there needs to be a basic, to do with the pension stuff, there needs to be thought about for the future for people who won't have gone to university, who might not be able to get better jobs. And I think that they kind of, when things are discussed, they kind of think of the best situations and, they will have money in the long term. But I think a lot more needs to be thought about with the whole representation. Mm.
Yeah, I think we could do with a lot more education on pensions, to be honest. It would be good now to know what our futures might be, whereas we pretty much just don't know.
Mm. Well, and of course, as we've heard already, one of the best pieces of advice you get is if you start young and start building up that pot from an early age, which you guys made them, I think you did, then you've got a better chance of having a bigger pot by the time you get to retirement age. Well, I would like to thank both of our representatives of different generations, both groups. I think they've been fantastic. I think they have brought out some of the issues. I hope it's a fair summary to say that for the older generation, the parental side, who aren't, of course, we haven't got any pensioners here, but for the older generation, there's a sense that the pension they've built up and the house they've built up came through some tough times. Life was not straightforward in the past, But it has been possible in a fairly straightforward way to build up a pension and a house. I think you've heard from the younger generation a feeling that both of these are more of a challenge. They require more planning, they require more effort. We've got here some excellent young people who are making that effort, but that things that happened perhaps for us in a fairly straightforward way are not going to be straightforward for them. But I personally end on a note of optimism. I think the more young people we have seizing the kind of opportunities that these students at Manchester University are seizing, then it actually leaves me optimistic for the future, provided we ensure that they have a fair deal in our national life in the future. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much. Thank you.